Hey everybody. Uh, cool. Thanks for filtering in. I think we had a little bit of a mix up and accidentally ended the other space a little too early. Um, but yeah, I think we can kick it off. Nandit, how's it going?
Yeah, going pretty good. So glad finally doing it. Quite excited.
Yeah, man. Well, maybe we should do a quick round of introductions just so for the folks in the room who don't know either of us, they know who we are. Um, yeah, I mean, great to meet everyone. If you don't already know me, my name is Jonathan Victor. I work at Protocol Labs. I do a lot on our ecosystem side. I've worked across our research team, the product side of IPFS and Filecoin. Now I work a lot on ecosystem growth. So I've been spending a lot of time working with startups in the Filecoin ecosystem who are thinking about data DAOs and perpetual storage. So yeah, super excited to be chatting today. And yeah, Nanda, do you want to introduce yourself in Lighthouse?
Yeah, sure. So hey everyone, I'm Nandit. I'm the founder of Lighthouse. At Lighthouse, we're building perpetual storage on Filecoin, and I've been in the space particularly in the Filecoin ecosystem from last 2 years. Started my journey with one of the Filecoin hackathons. Won one of them. Then was working in a company where I did Filecoin integrations, and then I started Lighthouse as an open source project. Initially, it was a Filecoin Ethereum bridge, and we can talk about that part as well. But then we later on pivoted to our pay one store forever proposition that we have right now. So yeah, that's what we are building at Lighthouse. But we're trying to learn a lot from our users and build everything that they need to store their data in the right way on IPFS and Filecoin. We also released this encryption SDK just 2 weeks back that also allows to store private data, build token gated applications, and then we have our dedicated gateways that can even stream 4K videos, and launch an image optimization feature last week, which will save a lot of bandwidth for the users. But yeah, learning a lot from our users, then building on the Filecoin network, and now very soon Filecoin virtual machine mainnet as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I mean, maybe just to kick it off, I think I guess the topic of today's episode here, talking about data DAOs and how we can improve them with the FEVM. I guess maybe to start, data DAOs can mean different things to different people. Do you have a mental model of how you think about what a data DAO is?
Yeah, I think how I think about data DAO is like a collective way to collect the data and then preserve that data, and then in a sustainable manner, incentivizing people uh, to contribute to that data store, and also whoever has contributed, not just they have to be monetized, um, as a collector and publisher of data, but also let's say if somebody else outside the ecosystem or the contributors want to access the data, they also can run computation on that data as well. But the right parties who were the original generators of data needs to be uh, incentivized as well. So I think, yeah, in a one way, Filecoin as a storage system, it can be used for storing and preserving that data. But then we need to have the right incentives for people to collect that data and then perform various computational activities and monetize that data with the right permissions.
Yeah, that totally resonates. I mean, the way I sort of think about it, like even if you just uncouple literally data and DAOs, it's like if DAOs are sort of like community owned protocols, data DAOs is saying like we have community owned data sets, and ownership does not necessarily mean monetization. It could be monetization if that's what people want to do with it. But it could also be talking about like how is that data stored, how is that data accessed, really putting that infrastructure into like the public space where it can be owned and hopefully like shared across many different folks. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious maybe to double click a little bit into some of the sort of like realms where we see data as today. I know there's folks who are doing interesting things in science, folks who are thinking about it more from there's folks who are doing like self-driving car data. I'm curious if there's any sort of data DAOs that you've been looking at, slash any use cases that you're particularly focused on as you think about things from the Lighthouse side.
Yeah, I think definitely if you see like the hottest topic of last year and this year is like Chat GPT itself, which is created by this company or organization called as OpenAI, but it hardly is open. It I call it mostly like closed AI, like Chat GPT by closed AI. So I think yeah, where we are right now with that as well, I definitely think that if even what like those models were open for other people to also use and contribute to that, that could be another whole ball game, and we might be even moving much faster than we are doing right now. And we even saw this with like GitHub's acquisition with Microsoft, where a lot of people are complaining now that Microsoft just ran all of their AI algorithms on their GitHub repos, and like they were the only central entity who benefited from all this. Like they have now a perfect model ready, which is like hardly accessible by anybody outside. But more than that, it's like quite proprietary. And I think being like in Web3 itself, I believe like uh, particularly AI and data science can benefit a lot from these open data sets, like how you mentioned about self-driving cars as well. Even right now there are like a lot of companies who have like control over like central uh, collection of data and like computation on top of that. Maybe be it Tesla or Cruise or some of the other companies that are out there. But I can just imagine how fast we would be moving as humanity if even like those companies could have a way to collaborate each other. But it's not even like okay, you just bring the data and just give it to the public for free. But if we have like proper access control conditions, that okay, if I can run some piece of computation on your data without even leaving your premise and get some results out of it, that is something that could be quite useful and still preserving um, your data into your premise as well, like kind of a on-chain royalty or licensing, I would say.
I mean, yeah, one thing that sort of struck me as you were talking, like one of the things that sort of makes Chat GPT possible is the fact that there is this like large corpus of openly available data. And so it's possible to train a large language model on top of all this stuff because people can just use the internet. And there's so many other types of data sets that don't really fit that model. So like self-driving is one where like I don't know if anyone's actually collecting nearly as much data as Tesla is. But when people talk about like health as well and sort of like medical data, there's like largely and like for good reasons, like we don't want that to be like publicly, or at least on the medical one, necessarily like fully publicly available. And I think it doesn't, whether we're doing this stuff in the Web3 way or the Web2 way, it doesn't change the fact that there's like certain properties that you need. But uh, in Web3, I think we're forced to confront these questions much earlier on in terms of like how will we do permissioning? How do we do value attribution up and down the stack of like from your data versus the model that was trained on top of it and so on. I think it's going to be interesting. It's hard to see exactly how things manifest, but I do think uh, like I think for me at least, the Chat GPT thing was a really interesting example of like the fact that this open data set exists was like the reason that this was possible. And then you start thinking about it seems in the Web2 way that it's like very unlikely that we will come up with good stories about like how do you like different organizations that are mutually non-trusting collaborate on permission data sets in order to like actually build these things. Um, and so it sort of implies that the outcome would then be something more like the Tesla thing, where you get like full vertical integration of one company doing these, like collecting the data and then sort of like monetizing it. And I think Web3, if we can design these things correctly, has the potential to say like this actually turns into a much more modular stack where like data owners are sort of like at the edges of like the people who generate it, and then you like hopefully can build the systems that allow people to tap into that just at the moment that they're training their models. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm curious. I don't know from your side if there's any specific teams that you're following or things that you think are particularly exciting inside of the Web3 space as experiments on this front. Have you guys been working with any teams that are like thinking about data DAOs specifically and like interesting use cases that you've been focused on?
Yeah, I think even in the current FVM cohort, I saw one of the teams called as Glacier Dao as well, who are allowing the ability to preserve repositories, like code repositories, um, on like permanent storage. that I would say, again, given the fact that GitHub had this interesting feature, as they say, like Arctic Code Vault. Um, but I think even then we saw like Tornado Cache, GitHub getting banned, and many other developers also facing issues with that. So I'm pretty optimistic about what Glacier Dao guys are doing with like preserving uh, open source code on the Filecoin network. Yeah, and I saw like there's this another project called as like Lagrange DAO as well. They are doing a pretty good job, and even like with us as well, we are like also working on a DAO platform which we are like yet to announce soon. But what that will do is again incentivize people to bring in their data together, and then they can also monetize that data through like Fill Plus program through the us. We call this program as like store to earn. Like not just you get to like store and have a collective pool of data together, but you can also get paid to store data as well. So yeah, that is another like one initiative that we thought that okay, let's get our hands dirty as well, uh, actually building some of these things. But I've been seeing like a lot of uh, activity from like FVM and Filecoin projects, especially like Glacier DAO is one good example around that too.
That's super cool. I mean, one thing that I've been really like interested in and thinking about is like once you have sort of like smart contract infrastructure and you can start building sort of the on-chain infrastructure, especially when we start thinking of data DAOs, there's sort of like the governance side of like how do we use the data, what will we do with it. Some of it might be like the permissioning side, but there's also sort of like this operational stuff that kind of uniquely through something like Filecoin you could start working on. Where if we start thinking about how does one solve for perpetual storage or permanent storage or whatever you want to call that. And I think this is like an interesting opportunity for things like DeFi, or like I've jokingly said before, it's like when although people may not believe it, like the point of Wall Street is not necessarily to speculate on stocks. Like the primary thing that Wall Street is used for is like helping companies finance and like raise capital and do productive things in the economy. And in the same way, it's kind of funny that we've worked backwards in this case with DeFi, where it sort of started from here are things that we're going to go do because it's sort of like PvPing with each other. But once we start actually having like real use cases for here are services in this economy that need to be serviced, then you actually have like buyers of DeFi products and use cases, which are not so much about like how do we sort of like flip the next thing, but more about like how do we actually like mitigate risk and like actually provide useful functionality. And I'm curious, especially on the like Lighthouse side of things, how you guys have been thinking about the incorporation of DeFi and sort of like what maybe even a new iteration of DeFi looks like that's more functionality focused and less about sort of like yeah, getting the 3 by 3 6-digit percentage increases.
Yeah, I think that's a definitely very interesting question. Again, as I was telling at start as well, like how started my journey in the Filecoin ecosystem. There was a time where I was we were working on Lighthouse, and it was like an open source Filecoin Ethereum bridge. And I think even after that, I saw like couple of good bridges by like textile team build like a Polygon and Near bridge. But interesting thing was even during that time, what we were trying to do was like, can we in a way have some smart contracts on a chain like Ethereum and then pay for storage on the Filecoin network and do something with it. And it was always, not getting to that pitch perfect level because you always had that like a centralized part that you have to manage, or a centralized piece of code that we have to run as our backend to make that happen. And that thing didn't have like actually pulled off. And I'm so glad that now, since we are building like this perpetual storage proposition on Lighthouse, and with FVM coming up, we need not worry about building our own centralized backend to connect Ethereum and the Filecoin storage network. Now we actually have the Filecoin chain itself, which can be connected to other EVM based chains as well. But how we think about perpetual storage in our case is that when user pays for a file, some part of it, again, depending on how many replications they want, we take and make deals with the miners on the Filecoin network and give back proofs to the users that they can verify that the data is actually stored. That too, again, on FVM smart contracts. But after that, like the remaining amount goes to like this smart contract based endowment pool, which is, you can imagine it more like a collective pool of funds. Like every user's buffer amount goes to that pool of funds, and like yeah, we will have it on chain, and anybody can see that okay, it's a transparent pool of funds. What's like the estimated cost of storage right now and down the line in the future, and we can give an estimate okay on how many years that pool of funds can sustain. But definitely with the DeFi primitives that we now have here, primarily in two ways that I see it. One is uh, like the Filecoin tokens itself that we can lend to some of the staking pools on the network, uh, like and lend it to the Filecoin miners. I know like Glyph team is working on something cool on the staking pool side. We've been like even exchanging our thoughts with them on how like they can build this model as well. But parallelly, apart from that, I think the remaining amount, like the coin amount, because we need to even let's say charge users for the bandwidth and some other services, they can be put into other DeFi services like Aave, Compound. Either that can be done even like through cross chain, but I think the easiest thing would be somebody just forks Compound or Aave code back on Filecoin network, and then we can use let's say our endowment pool reserves 50% into these Filecoin staking pools and the remaining part into the stablecoin pool. But again, all of this part can be controlled by not by me or any of our team wallet address, but more than like a DAO mechanism. And we are also thinking of okay on how we can get more community involved, and like if you're bringing like more data onto it, maybe you can have more say on how the fund pool are used, and like make sure that it's not used in like any wrong way, and there's a way to generate like yield which can fund your data till perpetuity.
Yeah, I mean, like the mental model that I have is effectively a data DAO, aside from the governance side, is basically like a giant pension fund. And in order to like be fully funded, the thing that you need to know is like what is your liabilities? So like what is the expenses that need to be incurred to go store your data, do all that stuff, and then having revenue that is at least that amount. And if you are doing that properly, you'll like perpetually be funded. Um, and so the interesting question is like, so how do you calculate the cost over time? And then how do you generate revenue? And those are like the two questions that need to be answered if you really want to solve this problem. And I think on Filecoin, the nice bit is like you can actually, I think, get to pretty clean answers on at least the cost side of like if you calculate it both in like dollars and in Filecoin, you can get to a number pretty easily if you're conservative. And then I think on the revenue side, it gets interesting because like the Filecoin portion, it's just stake your Filecoin, like you were saying. But like for the fiat portion, I think that's actually where there's a lot of optionality, whether that happens on Filecoin or even creating like data DAOs that are cross chain. Like now that DAI, as an example, has like a risk free rate, like you could build the fiat portion. There's no reason it couldn't exist on Ethereum, and then use like a bridge at the moment that you need to like strike deals or pay, just like send messages over that transfer the value. But I think this is where it's like it's not even just for the Filecoin like economy that this is going to be like a kind of interesting and powerful superpower, but more the fact that as we build things like cross-chain messaging and things like that, it's now superpowers that any other chain can tap into as well. Where yeah, if you are building in another economy, you now have the superpowers of today. It's just storage. But once we have retrieval markets, being able to distribute through a CDN, once you have computation, being able to like build derivative data sets and also include that inside, which I think is going to get super interesting. Um,
Yeah.
oh, I was going to say maybe we should pause here perhaps. And I don't know if there's any questions from the audience, but maybe we can pull some folks up. Otherwise, maybe we keep going.
Yeah, sure. If anybody has any question, I can answer that.
Hey, Matt.
Hello, hello. I thought I'd just pop up because this is great. The discussion we're having so far. I mean, there's as you mentioned, there's so many different kind of use cases with data DAOs. But I just realized, kind of as we're discussing this, that there may be a number of people kind of new that are on this space that are new to the concept of what FEM actually is. And so I thought maybe it'd be worthwhile just doing a little bit of a recap on what FEM is in relation to Filecoin and how it enables some of these use cases. Is that what do
Yeah,
you think?
do it.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So Filecoin for those that don't know, Filecoin's a decentralized storage network. Now, the storage itself is off-chain. There's a number of storage providers. There's about, I think, the current number is about 4,000, something like that, storage providers worldwide, and we've got something in the region of about 17 exabytes of data committed storage capacity. Now, all of the accounting for that storage happens on the blockchain, on the Filecoin chain, and the proof that people have the storage and they are storing the data. So if I ask a storage provider to store the data, the receipt for that storage operation has happened gets stored on the blockchain, on the Filecoin blockchain. And then periodically, the storage provider has to prove that they've still got that data and they've not lost it or destroyed it or whatever. And they have to do a proof. And again, that goes on the Filecoin blockchain. And when they do that, they then get a reward for doing so. So that's the kind of the incentivization bit of Filecoin and how like the storage network works. Then on top of that, what we now have that we're building is the FVM, the Filecoin virtual machine. And the Filecoin virtual machine is a polyglot virtual machine, multilingual virtual machine. You can run different runtimes on top of it. And the first runtime that we're working on is the FEVM, the Filecoin Ethereum virtual machine, which emulates or provides the same kind of functionality as an Ethereum virtual machine that you'd run on Ethereum or many of the other EVM compatible blockchains. So the idea behind this is that you're now able to take Solidity smart contracts or smart contracts written in other languages compiled down to EVM bytecode and deploy them on the Filecoin network. So as Nandit mentioned before about Lighthouse and some of the stuff they were originally doing on Ethereum, they're using blockchains like Ethereum for a lot of the logic and then Filecoin for the storage. Now with FVM and FEVM, you can do all of those things on the same blockchain. And why would you want to do that? Well, one of the advantages is within those smart contracts, you can actually see the data that's on the Filecoin blockchain. So you can see the storage metadata. So you can't access the raw data, but you can access all of the data about the data. So you can see what, whether something has been stored, whether a storage provider's got it. Sorry, my dog going nuts in the background here. And so you can then start to make certain assertions about that. And then you can build things like these data DAOs on top, in which you might, for example, aggregate funds from a number of different people, could send in funds into a smart contract. That smart contract could collect those payments and then use those to negotiate, say, a storage deal on behalf of those users and pay for that storage. And that's where you can get things like the Perpetual storage and things like Lighthouse and Glacier Dao and these various other data DAO kind of use cases. So hopefully that's a good kind of recap of just kind of letting people kind of hopefully fit where the data DAO stuff fits in with FVM and what FVM is enabling, allowing these data DAOs to kind of come to light. Because really, it's not been possible so far within like the DeFi and Web3 space to have storage as being an actual primitive on the network, right? Typically there's been, currencies and value in that respect, but storage has always been like one step beyond, whereas this actually brings storage now and storage capacity as an actual first-class citizen within DeFi and within Web3. So you could almost imagine you could have some kind of like an AMM in which storage capacity is on one side of that AMM, right? And people are actually trading storage capacity directly, right? Not trading value and currency and money by which they buy that storage capacity, but the actual storage capacity itself can become a first-class citizen. So that gives a lot of interesting things there. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful to people.
I think like two things that you said that sort of stuck out that I think are super interesting. So like, I mean, one side of it is sort of this idea that like, in some senses, like the big bet that crypto is making is we're going to build these interesting financial rails and eventually like we get the real world to sort of adopt them so that we can like use these services in more places. Like that is sort of like the giant payments bet. It's like, how do we get the real world to adopt these crypto rails? And I think like one of the fascinating things about this ecosystem is this is sort of like the inverse of that bet, which is like, what if we could just start building a bunch of businesses that already natively accept crypto rails and then like make those services really, really powerful. So especially as we start imagining like what could happen with things like DeFi and like what people will build, I think that's like one of the kind of interesting superpowers that like the Filecoin ecosystem sort of has. The other thing, which I think is super fascinating, you sort of mentioned this in like how things are laid out in the FEM, but the fact that sort of like deals are this like lower level thing, and like we're writing smart contracts around like the metadata of like the data that's stored on the network, it means that you also get like this really nice modularity feature where you can even have multiple data DAOs that are like both sponsoring the storage of a piece of data. And so it means that like you can have all this experimentation around like funding models as well. You could have something that's fully funded. You could have something that's very conservative and overfunded. You could have insurance models. And so it leads to a lot of experimentation like possibilities about like what are actually the most effective ways of doing things, especially if you're trying to work and like people will have different types of data with different types of use cases where you may not need the same levels of security. And so maybe for your use case, you're happy to take, a less conservative position. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what people build. And I'm glad we have folks who are pulling all the different levers. Um, sorry, Nanda, I think before you were going to say something as well.
Um, yeah, I think just to add on that point of even like data DAOs, I think another area I was just pointing that we are quite excited about even is like decentralized science, and particularly I think that's where even data DAOs can be used to store like these open access papers and journals, and again help to um, have like reproducible experiments and have incentives for scientists to publish their papers over time, because a lot of these I think funding even in like science is like sometimes controlled by central entities, and if scientists itself they can be brought together. And I think there's like one of the things that I think about a lot like nowadays is like how just like as you were even asking at start, okay, how which are like the top DAOs and data DAOs that we are talking to. I think yeah, like NFTs is one straight example, as we can see that because in Web3 most of the data being coming around is around NFTs as well. So we are seeing like a lot of NFT data being stored on Lighthouse, but even we as a team we started to build our tools around that, but now we are aiming towards going towards like the massive Web2 market, and even focusing on getting even retail audience to use it, be it like if they're like scientists who want to fund their research through these data DAO mechanisms, or even it could be like just an end user who want to store their data perpetually through a, let's say a end user interface. But yeah, those are like some of the things I wanted to add, like where some of our um, thoughts on who the end user could be and how they can benefit from all of these mechanisms. Or
Yeah, decentralized science (DeSci) is like you said, that's a very interesting use case, right? Because there's a lot of scientific applications where they have large quantities of data, and it's large quantities of data that you quite often want and need researchers from around the world to be able to have access to. And how do you do that, and how do you pay for that storage to allow them to do that? Well, data DAOs could be a way of solving that. And what is interesting is within the kind of protocol labs ecosystem, there's a project called Bacalhau, and Bacalhau is all about decentralized compute. And that's all working off chain just because of the sheer scale and size of the data. Um, but they could then use things like FEM and data DAOs to actually, like you say, control access to that data, or account for the funding for the storage of that data. You could build on top of that kind of markets for running computation on that data. So I could store some data, and it might be a case of I want to run some computation, and I can, encode the job that I want to do and store it on the Filecoin network using FEVM, and compute providers can see that. Maybe there's a market where they can bid for that or choose to run that. They can run that computation, and that's run completely off chain, but they can then provide a proof about that on chain. And the big difference again is that yes, you could do that with any other EVM contract, but with FEVM, you can make assertions that the data is actually stored, right? So if a computation process comes back and says, we've run this, we've stored the data is at this IPFS CID or this, Filecoin CID, then with FEVM, you can actually, the smart contract can check and see, is that data actually there? Is there a storage contract on the network? Is there a storage deal on the network for that CID? And because of the unique properties of the way in which content addressing, sorry, that's what CID stands for, content addressing works, is if you have an address, you can be assured that the content stored at that address is intact, because the address is based upon a hash of the data itself. So if I store some data and I have a CID, a content address, that is related to that data that I've actually stored. I can't change the data without changing the address. So then when I store that CID in the smart contract can actually check and say, yes, that data is stored on the Filecoin network. And oh, by the way, it's got 5 replicas. So we know if one of them goes down, it's still going to be available. And maybe it's, we can make some kind of assertion there as to the health of the data, and the smart contract can then do that, right? And maybe even incentivize that within the data DAO process. So that's where it starts to get really interesting.
I think we have Sarah who had something, and then maybe we can try to grab some audience questions in the last 6 minutes or so.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. Sarah here from the FEM DX team, same as Matt. Yeah, earlier you're talking a little bit about DAOs and what people are building. I just thought it'd be a really good time to share some quick examples of projects that are already in progress. We have an early builders cohort. They are building on FEVM themselves, and for DAOs, like we see, like it's our most popular use case amongst all our early builder teams. Like it is the most popular at hackathons as well. So we get a lot of projects around it. And in the DeSci space, for sure, that's a huge one. Like we have people combining how a data DAO would traditionally work together with the computation portion to be able to come up with DeSci solutions and platforms. So we have like Lagrange DAO, we have Purio, and that's like particularly for science papers. And we also had Catalog DAO, which was purely focused on carbon development projects and how you can track reporting and digital measurement with that DAO itself. So a lot of interesting use cases in the DeSci space. Another one that was really cool that I wanted to share about was SPN DAO, which is also part of our early builders cohort. What they're doing is to think about users uploading all of their credit card data to a DAO and then having the treasury be funded by companies that are interested in the data itself, but then the users get rewarded directly for any use or decryption of their data for use by these companies. So these are all really good real life examples of how DAOs can come into play and how FEVM can come help automate and optimize a lot of those operations within a DAO. So yeah, I just want to share a few of these examples.
Awesome. Yeah, those are super cool. Maybe given our 5 minutes left, are there other questions? Anyone want to come up? Otherwise, Lucas, did you have one?
Sure. Thanks. I'm just curious, like in the world that we live in today, there are already a number of kind of business models that extract value from collectively created and maintained data sets. What's kind of typically true is that while the value creation happens collectively, the value extraction is typically centralized, right? So for example, case in point, like we all contribute our data by using Twitter and add value to its advertising capabilities, but only Twitter captures that value, right? By actually monetizing this collectively created data set. I'm curious, like, what is the potential for some of these conventional data organizations to be disrupted by data also organizations, but in this case kind of decentralized and autonomous. I'm curious if there's like, if you could like walk us through some. And then my other question was like around this thing that you mentioned earlier around value pools and kind of value attribution along the value chain of data, right? So just curious to hear like how you might size and ultimately attribute value creation up and down the value chain. Like how might you go about measuring the specific value of a single person adding their genome, for example, to a larger genetic data set, and how would you attribute that value and measure it? Thank you.
I can take a stab. I don't know if others have hot takes. Oh, okay. I will take a stab. I guess for the first one, so it's interesting. I think I would slightly maybe complicate the picture a little bit more, because it's like uh, the data contribution is like one component, but like in a sense, what's happening is like Twitter is also playing multiple roles. Like they are collecting a bunch of revenue from like advertising and whatever, sort of like stewarding data. They're also the ones who are like running all of the expenses, right? Like we use Twitter for free, or at least I do, because I do not have a blue check mark. And so I think one thing that's really interesting when we start thinking about Web3 infrastructure and sort of the space in general is we're basically saying like we can turn that model into something that is much more fluid and much more dynamic, both in terms of like who is paying the costs and who is accruing the value. And it allows people to then segment much more naturally into like, what side of this equation do you want to play, right? Like, do you want to be providing your own infrastructure? Do you want to like fully cede all of that to a third party and let them sort of capture all the value? And I think like the fact that it's a market also then sort of bounds the ability for any individual party to extract on either side. And I think that's going to be actually the most interesting feature of all of this stuff, where, yeah, like if, and this hopefully happens like fully up and down the stack, like even at the miner level or like the storage provider level, like if you have a fungible set of server or like service providers that are like, they won't be one for one completely non-fungible, but like or like there's going to be like incremental differences. It does still bound the condition of like your ability to rent extract if there is a provider who is offering something that is highly comparable and like the switching cost is super, super low. And I think like when we start thinking about building in public infrastructure, I think that is like one of the superpowers that we get. And I think it like, the interesting analogy is that it extends way further than just infrastructure providing. It's like literally from data creation, monetization, all the way through. I think for, what was your second question? I totally forgot.
Around value pools and value
Yeah.
attribution.
I think this is a really hard problem, but I think this is a problem that we have to solve in a bunch of different ways. I don't know if folks have heard of like the Funding the Commons conference. It's something that Protocol Labs runs about how we fund public goods. But this is like a problem that shows up in a bunch of different places. One that I think about a lot is sort of in research, where you have this like public good of like the fundamental research, and then there's like some amount of work that gets subsidized by like a public government, and then post that you have someone who's taking it to market, and then like the value capture happens there. But there's this like question of, and like theoretically if you were to really close that loop, if the government is taxing properly, then the like that is how like the public goods get refunded. um, but there's this like bigger question, I think, that we have about like how do we do this for all the other places where you have sort of this like sort of dynamic. So I'm hoping that the tools that people develop, things like hypercerts, might be useful in this sort of way, where we can like hopefully do better. I don't think there is a clean answer today about like how do we figure out the exact ratio and split of like how like value should be attributed and how that should happen. I think the thing that Web3 gives us is not an answer, but a framework to experiment. And I think it gives us the right primitives that would allow you to easily sort of like run multiple experiments, rather than it like reduces the cost of trying different things until we can iterate to the right solution, which is kind of a non-answer. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think even additional point to that. I think even I don't have the exact answer to how will you incentivize somebody for providing every single data point. But I think over a period of time, as an individual gets a collection of their own data points, I think then that maybe turns out to be a valuable data set. Um, plus parallelly either those individual users can come together, and then together that data set can form a larger valuable data set, and then there could be a way of, okay, who has the most contribution to that collective of data, and then let's incentivize accordingly, maybe in a period of time. Let's say if you added a data, the most data in a one day, so rather than giving everyone some points, we can be like, okay, giving to the highest contributor to that data. But I think another important point there is again around data privacy as well, rather than just letting Twitter capture all of the value. I think important another point is even around, if I can still have my data and it be computed on, but it's still not leaving, let's say, my access, right? So I think a lot of people this may not know about this thing, but even on Google Drive, if you keep a lot of your data there, your documents there, Google on back run AI algorithms, and that's why you see, okay, on emails now you have these checks completion and some of these other algorithms as well. So as a user, maybe at start I do not wish to get incentivized for every data point that I produce, but maybe over a period of time, at least if I can have a say of delegating on who have those decision, what computations are run on it, and if I can protect my data in some sense. Yeah, but yeah, I don't have the exact answer on how do we split the monetized, yeah, to every single data point and individual exactly.
Well, I think we're a couple minutes over, but I think this is a kind of nice segue into, if you have ideas on how this should be done, there are a couple hackathons that are coming up. So I think there's an ep-hackathon, and I think the registration for that closes on January 18th. So if you have an idea, highly encourage you to go give it a spin, try to build it. And there's also microgrants that are available. So the next, I think, window closes January 19th for the microgrants. So if you have an idea, you've put a little work into it, there's funding available if you want to take the next step with that. And then I guess the last thing is we'll be having our next Twitter space in 2 weeks. So yeah, hopefully we'll see you all there.
And just to say, if you want to find out about those microgrants and the hackathon's run in conjunction with ETH Global. But if you go to spacewarp.fvm.dev, then that's where all the details are of the project we've got going called Spacewarp, which is the project in which we're running the microgrants, the hackathons, and some other stuff under as well. So go check that out if you want to find out more.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome, thank you.